Well, we all know that war is hell, but have you ever wondered how people used to go to war? Well, this series will be an exploration into medieval weapons and warfare. To kick things off, let's take a look at one of the most iconic medieval weapons of all time, the sword. Swords are one of the oldest and most enduring weapons in human history. And during the Middle Ages, they were utilized by everyone from the common foot soldier to the king himself. But not all swords were created equal. In fact, there was a huge variety of different types of swords used during this time period, each with its own unique design and purpose. One of the earliest and most recognizable types of medieval swords is the Viking sword. As the name suggests, these swords originated in Scandinavia and were typically characterized by their long, slender, double-edged blades and their distinctive crossguards, which often featured animalistic designs. Viking swords were primarily used by warriors and were highly prized for their strength and versatility in battle. Another iconic type of medieval sword is the knightly sword, also known as a bastard sword or a hands and a half sword. These swords were typically longer than Viking swords and had a single edge on one side of the blade and a double edge on the other. They were used by mounted knights and were designed to be used with one hand on the grip and the other supporting the shield. Knightly swords were often decorated with intricate designs and were seen as symbols of the knight's status and power. But not all swords were meant for offense. The medieval sword was also used defensively, such as the buckler, which was a small, light sword designed to deflect blows while leaving the wearer's dominant hand free to wield a shield. Bucklers were commonly used by infantry soldiers and were particularly effective when paired with a large shield. Another defensive sword was the dagger, which was shorter than other types of swords and had a single edge. Daggers were typically carried by soldiers and civilians alike, and were often used for self-defense or as a backup weapon. Of course, no discussion of medieval swords would be complete without mentioning the legendary Excalibur. This mythical sword is said to have been wielded by King Arthur, and was believed to have been forged by Merlin the Wizard. While Excalibur may be a work of fiction, it captures the imagination and has inspired countless works of art and literature over the centuries. But how were these swords actually used in battle? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some historians argue that medieval sword fighting was a highly stylized form of combat that involved a lot of posturing and ceremony. This is largely based on surviving treatises on sword fighting, which often describe combat as a series of duels between individual knights or swordsmen. However, other historians argue that this is a misleading view of medieval battle, since these treatises were often written by professional swordsmen who had little experience in actual warfare. Sword fighting in battle was a messy, chaotic affair that involved multiple opponents and was fought in close quarters. Most swordsmen were not highly trained professionals, but rather average soldiers who were forced to rely on their wits and their endurance as much as their skill with a sword. To understand how swords were used in battle, it's important to know how they were made. Swords went through several stages of production, beginning with the selection of the right metal. The best swords were made from high-carbon steel, which was produced by smelting iron ore and then heating it to a high temperature until the impurities burned off. This process was called steel making and was a highly skilled profession in itself. Once the steel was produced, it was then heated and hammered into a blade shape. This was done by specialized sword makers called swordsmiths, who had to have a deep understanding of the properties of steel in order to create a strong and durable blade. Finally, the blade was etched and sharpened to create the cutting edge. This process required a great deal of precision and skill, and the quality of the etch and sharpening would directly affect the sword's effectiveness in battle. Once the sword was complete, it was ready to be used in battle. Swords could be used in a variety of ways depending on the swordsman's skill and experience. The most basic attack was the slash, which could be delivered either vertically or horizontally. The slash was an effective way to attack an opponent's armor, especially if it was done at a downward angle. Another common attack was the thrust, which was a quick, stabbing motion that could penetrate an opponent's defenses more easily than a slash. Thrusts were often used in conjunction with a shield, as the shield could be used to protect the swordsman from incoming attacks, while he was vulnerable after delivering a thrust. In addition to these basic attacks, some swordsmen also knew how to strike a killing blow, meaning a blow that was intended to end the fight quickly by decapitating or dismembering the opponent. Killing blows were often the result of years of experience and training, and not all swordsmen were skilled enough to land one. Despite their iconic status, swords were not necessarily the most practical weapon in medieval warfare. That's because they had several limitations. For one thing, swords required a high degree of skill to use effectively. A well-trained swordsman could be a fearsome sight to behold, but a novice could easily end up hurting himself more than his opponent. Additionally, swords were relatively expensive to produce, which meant that they were not widely available to the average foot soldier. Finally, swords were not very effective against heavily armored opponents. It took a lot of force to penetrate a knight's armor, and even then, the swordsman risked breaking his blade against the metal. As a result, swords were most effective in situations where the swordsman had a clear advantage over his opponent, such as when he was fighting against an unarmored opponent, or when he had the element of surprise. So what was the fate of the medieval sword? As firearms became more widespread and powerful, the sword fell out of favor as a weapon of war. However, it continued to be used ceremonially and as a symbol of power and authority well into the modern era. Today, the medieval sword is primarily a relic of the past, but it remains an iconic symbol of the medieval period and the warrior ethos. Whether wielded by a legendary king or an ordinary foot soldier, the sword is a reminder of the courage and skill of those who went to war in the medieval world. Alright guys, that's a look at one of the most iconic medieval weapons of all time, the sword. Join me next time for another episode of Songs of Steel, where we'll explore another aspect of medieval weapons and warfare. See you then.